session 3 this time, converting labeling from older drugs from the old format to the PLR format. And it's my privilege at this time to introduce our speaker first off, who you've already met, Farokh Sarabi from the Labeling Development Team at FDA. And I'd also like to introduce our panelists for this session, Ingrid Brzezinski, and she is the Senior Director of Strategic Global Labeling, Regulatory Affairs at AbbVie. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Farokh.
All right, well, thank you, Anne-Marie. So hopefully we're all re-energized from lunch and ready to dive back into labeling. This is my disclaimer slide. So an overview of my talk, I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the physician labeling rule. You heard a little bit about this earlier in the morning session. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about voluntary PLR conversions and perhaps some of the considerations to think about when deciding which older product labeling might benefit the most from voluntary PLR conversion. And then really the substance of the talk will be on the conversion of labeling approved in the old format, sometimes also called non-PLR format, to the PLR format for older drugs. We'll start out by looking at some general principles, and then I'm going to look at several sections from the full prescribing information and include some examples that hopefully help solidify some of the concepts. Lastly, I'm going to round things out by briefly discussing development of other parts of the prescribing information. So first of all, some general principles that pertain to all labeling, whether they are in the old format or the PLR format. Labeling must contain a summary of the essential scientific information needed for safe and effective use of the drug, be informative and accurate and neither promotional in tone nor false or misleading in any particular, and be updated when new information becomes available that causes the labeling to become inaccurate, false, or misleading. So really, labeling is not static. We all know it's a living document, a dynamic document that changes with new scientific information, new regulations, guidance, and so forth. Now, the physician labeling rule, or PLR, is the common term that's used to refer to the final rule that was published January 24, 2006. And this bullet lists the location of the PLR regulations at 21 CFR. And really, the final rule revised the content and format requirements of labeling for human prescription drugs with the intent of making the labeling easier to access, read, and use for the target audience, which is the healthcare practitioner, and also with the intent of reducing medication errors that could result from misunderstood or incorrectly applied labeling information. So what does PLR apply to? Well, it applies to, and again, we heard some of this earlier in the morning, but I think it's always good to review. It applies to all NDAs, BLAs, and efficacy supplements approved on or after June 30, 2001. So these applications are required to have their labeling in the PLR format. That, of course, then means that NDAs and BLAs approved all the way back to 1938, up to June 29, 2001, without a subsequent efficacy supplement approval, are not required to have their labeling in PLR format. However, they can voluntarily PLR convert at any time. And this is a pretty wide time span. This is more than 60 years. Strictly speaking, when I say older drug, I'm referring to anything that falls within this window, but in many cases, when we say older drug, at least I'm thinking of things that were closer to 1938 than to 2001, because those products sometimes pose unique challenges with their labeling. Now, there have been efforts to increase the number of PLR labeling, and we again heard a little bit about this from Eric's talk earlier this morning. One of those mechanisms is through voluntary PLR conversions. And FDA has publicly encouraged voluntary PLR conversions really since the 2006 final rule was published. And I have a couple of quotes on this slide. These come from the preamble to that final rule. And I won't read them verbatim, but this first one really illustrates that from the get-go, there was a recognition of the value that the PLR format was going to add to the overall quality of prescription drug labeling. And the second quote from the preamble demonstrates this early encouragement to voluntarily PLR convert for those older products which are not required to have their labeling in PLR. Now, in 2013, FDA again publicly stated that it would be in the best interest of public health to increase the number of PLR labeling. And that was in a Federal Register notice. So again, here are a couple quotes from that FR notice. And again, I won't read this one all the way through, but I think it's interesting that now with about 7 years of hindsight since the final rule had been published, this sort of represented an affirmation that PLR format really does represent a more useful and modern approach for communicating labeling information. And this second quote from that same FR notice I think is really striking. FDA strongly encourages all applicants to voluntarily PLR convert their labeling, regardless of the approval date. So when prioritizing voluntary PLR conversions of older drug labeling, here are some potential factors to consider in terms of which ones potentially should move up on the list and might benefit the most from a PLR conversion. I think high drug use is a really important consideration. So if you have a product that's highly visible, it's commonly prescribed, be it in the inpatient setting, outpatient setting, or both, from a public health standpoint, it makes a lot of sense not only to ensure that that labeling is accurate and up to date, but as easy to access, read, and use as possible, even if it is an older product. Some of the other factors to think about would be products that have particularly complex safety issues, where perhaps some of that key safety-related information can be better conveyed through the PLR format. And along the same lines, if there have been reports of medication errors with a product that may have been related to misunderstood or incorrectly applied labeling information, potentially the PLR conversion could help remedy some of those issues. Now, the implementing the PLR content and format requirements guidance was an important labeling guidance that was finalized in February of 2013, and it provides recommendations for a host of topics, including developing new PLR labeling, developing the highlights, formatting issues, and particularly relevant to today's talk, it also provides recommendations for revising labeling already approved in the old format to PLR. So in some of the subsequent slides where I go through some principles for PLR conversion, some of those recommendations will have been extracted from this guidance. So with that background in mind, I'd like to now talk about some general principles for PLR conversion of older drug labeling. And really, it's a reminder that making the transition from the old format to the PLR format provides an ideal opportunity to review the entire labeling for general quality and also to really work to make the labeling a better communication tool. So here are some principles to bear in mind in that endeavor. One is to identify information in the old format labeling that is pertinent to prescribing decisions and to omit clearly inapplicable or inappropriate information. So if there's information in the old format approved labeling that really is not essential for the safe and effective use of the drug, that could be potentially omitted when the labeling is PLR converted. Or if there's information in the approved old format labeling that perhaps was clinically relevant or useful many years ago, but is now clinically obsolete or not clinically useful, then again, that could potentially be omitted. One of the cornerstones of PLR conversion is distribution and reorganization of information into the appropriate PLR format locations. But really beyond just reorganizing, moving things around, I want to emphasize the distribution component. Because typically, information is most relevant to a specific section of labeling. So it's really key to place important clinical information pertinent to prescribing decisions in the section that most appropriately imparts that information. Then other labeling sections may briefly describe or refer to the topic, but not repeat the same level of detail. And this is one place where cross-references can be a very handy way of directing the healthcare practitioner to other labeling section where they can go for additional details. It's also important to order information within a section based on the content's clinical importance and relative public health significance. And this principle is more applicable to some sections than others. For example, contraindications, if you have multiple contraindications, or warnings and precautions, if there are several warnings and precautions subsections, it's really important to think critically about the order in which that information is presented when you PLR convert. PLR conversion provides an opportunity to revise labeling, to clarify text, eliminate redundancies, and to update terminology. And I talked a little bit in the last slide about how optimal distribution of information throughout the PI can really help potentially eliminate some of those redundancies. Bear in mind that unapproved indications or uses or dosing regimens must not be implied or suggested in labeling. So again, when PLR conversions are done, it's an opportunity to review the entire labeling content and make sure that this regulatory requirement is satisfied if it's applicable here. and also to remove unsubstantiated claims and remove or revise outdated information. Now, with older products in particular, sometimes the amount of data that's available is limited, or the data may be of limited accessibility. And so I think it's important to bear in mind that in general, no new data analyses of the information in the old format are required, provided that the labeling is truthful and accurate. Now, there may be some exceptions to that. So if the existing information in the approved old format labeling is inaccurate, and the only real way to appropriately update it to make the information accurate requires some form of data reanalysis or new analyses, on the case-by-case basis, that may be needed. But in general, I want to emphasize that tremendous amount can be accomplished in improving the overall quality of labeling through PLR conversion without having to do new data analyses. And another point to bear in mind is that certain major labeling updates may not be appropriate for a PLR conversion labeling supplement. So for example, a proposal to add a new dosing regimen, or a proposal to revise an indication statement in a manner that could expand the population in whom the drug is indicated. So with those general principles behind us, I'd like to now look at selected sections from the full prescribing information, because I think, again, examples sometimes help to solidify the concepts. Now, as most of us know, in the PLR format, there are up to 18 sections in the full prescribing information. And of course, they're all of importance. But in the interest of time and also to focus the discussion, I'm going to focus just on the 8 sections that I have highlighted here in yellow today. I think during this 2-day conference, we've had opportunities already to hear about some of these other sections that I won't address in my talk. And I believe we'll, in subsequent talks, also have some of these other sections discussed. So I hope that the focus of the panel discussion will also be geared toward these sections I'm going to cover today. I'm going to briefly touch on the indications and usage section. We had an excellent talk on this earlier this morning that was extremely thorough, but I just wanted to include a couple of points that maybe are particularly important to bear in mind for older drugs. So one is, again, PLR conversion is an opportunity to revisit the indications and usage section and update the indication statement, if appropriate, to reflect current terminology and ensure that the statement's clinically relevant, scientifically valid, and understandable to healthcare practitioners. It's also an opportunity to delete generalized discussions or move information that's really not appropriate for this section to other more appropriate sections of the labeling. This really gets back to that optimal distribution issue. Sometimes with older product labeling, you'll find that there's a lot of additional information in the indications and usage section. And it may very well be important, but perhaps not optimally conveyed in this section. So let's look at an example. And before I go through this example, just to let you know the layout of my examples for my slides will be I'll initially project the old format text, and then I'll walk through some of the key points, and I generally try to color code things to illustrate. Then I'll project the PLR converted text, and we'll look at some of the changes that I proposed and what the rationale was, and we'll walk through that. These examples are all fictitious examples. However, in some cases, the challenges that I'm illustrating are based on actual challenges that I've seen in PLR conversion of older drug labeling. So with that in mind, let's look at the old format text for this first example. Under the indications and usage section heading, it says that the drug X is indicated for the relief of symptoms in adults with acute and recurrent diabetic gastric stasis, there in green. Then following that, in the second paragraph, it starts out there in blue by talking about really the data that supported the approval. The effectiveness of drug X was established in 2 12-week clinical trials. The next sentence then starts talking about the usual manifestations of delayed gastric emptying and how these, there in red, responded to drug X within different time intervals. So that's really getting into more trial outcome type information. Again, all of this is important information, but it raises the question of whether it's optimally conveyed in this section. So now I've grayed out the old format, and I'm going to project the PLR converted text, and we can walk through this together. So I think the first thing that stands out is the section looks a lot shorter. So really in the spirit of concisely but clearly identifying to the healthcare provider what are the indicated uses for this drug, I propose drug X is indicated for the relief of symptoms in adults with acute and recurrent diabetic gastroparesis. So I updated the terminology here. This condition is no longer called diabetic gastric stasis. And even though this seems like a minor adjustment, I think it's an important one to consider because it really can have an effect that healthcare providers have in terms of the confidence they have in the labeling. You can imagine if a healthcare provider picks up an older drug labeling and they start reading a lot of outdated terminology, they may quickly lose confidence in the labeling and may wonder if they should keep reading. The other major noticeable change here is that the second paragraph in the old format text is, again, really information not appropriate for the INU section, and so I've removed it. Now, again, it's important information, so perhaps it would be very well appropriate to incorporate it into the clinical study section. Okay, moving on now to dosage and administration, or DNA section. This is a section that in the PLR format receives far greater prominence. I don't know, some of you may remember in the old format, the DNA section is second from last. It comes right above how supplied. So it really kind of got no respect in the old format, but I think the PLR regulations really recognize how important this section is for the healthcare provider. And now it appropriately immediately comes after the indications and usage section. So some principles for this section will ensure the information is clear and accessible. And again, this applies to every section in the FPI, but I specifically put it here because I think of all the FPI sections, the DNA section is potentially the one with the greatest potential to reduce medication errors when it's really well written and developed. So what are some strategies to improve the clarity and accessibility of this section? Well, one would be to develop subsections to organize the information. So the PLR format encourages that and affords that opportunity. And bear in mind that with PLR format, you also have a table of contents. So any subsections that are created will be enumerated in the table of contents and the subsection titles written out in full. And so that can really help with the accessibility of the section and make it more navigable. It's also important that the subsection titles clearly identify the content of the subsection. There's the old adage that a picture can say 1,000 words. I would argue that particularly for complex dosage or administration schemes, tables, flowcharts, or diagrams can really, in some cases, help to convey complex information in a much more concise, clear way than a paragraph or two of dense text. Another principle to bear in mind for this section, I think, is best illustrated if we compare what the old format regulation says for this section versus the PLR format. So I have the old format regulation there in the left column, and the PLR format regulation on the right column. And it really has to do with the fact that the old format regulation requires that this section state the usual dose, the usual dosage range. Well, the PLR format regulations really took the usual component out of the equation, and the emphasis is the requirement to state the recommended dose, shown there in blue highlight. So with that in mind, state the recommended dosage as opposed to the usual dosage. And then consider using active voice when you're revising the section. That is command language, directive language. Again, keeping in mind what the main purpose of this section is, it's an action section for the healthcare practitioner. In general, the more you use directive language, the more concise the statements are, the easier they are to read. I sometimes like to say if it's a complex DNA section, the more it reads like a cookbook recipe. In general, the better. Step 1, do this. Step 2, and so forth. So I have an example, which I hope can help illustrate some of these points. So again, looking at the old format text, there under the DNA section heading, it starts out by saying there in green that the usual dosage of drug X is 20 milligrams once daily. The next paragraph is all about dosage adjustments in patients with varying degrees of hepatic impairment. And you can see it's a rather lengthy paragraph, but I also want to point out there in blue that there's this use of passive voice. So the dosage should be decreased by or should be halved. I've also illustrated there in red text that rather than giving the dosage adjustment as number of milligrams per unit of time, the recommendations are about decreasing by a certain percentage. The last paragraph is about dosage adjustments in patients who develop diarrhea, which is an adverse reaction with this drug. And again, in blue text there, you have passive voice. Should be reduced, should be discontinued. So that's the before. I've shrunken it and graded out so we can really look at the PLR converted text in more detail together. And this is what I propose. And I want to point out a few things. The first thing is that I created 3 subsections to organize the information. And the subsection titles clearly identify the content. So now we have 2.1, recommended dosage. That's all about the recommended dosage in the general indicated population. 2.2 is about modifications in dosage because of diarrhea. And 2.3 is dosage modifications in patients with hepatic impairment. So again, these subsections are going to be spelled out in the table of contents. But if we take that a step further now and think about the electronic version of the labeling, these subsections will all be hyperlinked as well. So you can imagine if you have a busy healthcare provider, say a hepatologist, who primarily treats patients with some degree of hepatic impairment. With these subsections enumerated, they can go right to 2.3 in the table of contents, click that, and immediately find out the information that they need on how to dose this drug in their patient who's sitting right next to them in the office who may have some degree of hepatic impairment. Other changes I made, I modified from usual to recommended. I've also used active voice here. So now it says reduce the dosage rather than the dosage should be reduced. Discontinue drug X rather than should be discontinued. And the final main point is I proposed a table here to present the dosage modification scheme. And I think this makes the information pop more visually. It's more accessible than a paragraph of text. And I also proposed presenting the dosages in actual milligrams per unit of time rather than by decreasing by 50% or halving. Now, in some cases, it may be fine to leave it as a decrease by a certain percentage. For example, if you have a very wide dosage, recommended dosage range. But in this straightforward example, I think by spelling out what the recommended dosage adjustment is in more concrete terms, you're sparing the healthcare practitioner from having to do an additional calculation where they could potentially make a medication error. Okay, so moving on now to some of the key safety-related sections of the FPI. I'm going to start out with the contraindication section. This is a very important section to revisit. We heard a little bit about this section in earlier talks. It's important to review it and include only known contraindications. So remove theoretical possibilities. Along these same lines, I think it's illustrative to look at, again, a comparison. One of the key differences between the old format regulations for this section there on the left versus the PLR format regulations in the right column. And I think, again, in an earlier talk, we heard about some of these definitions. But it's interesting to look and see that the old format regulations, in the list of situations that could be appropriate for a contraindication statement, it listed one of them as being there in the gray text there, continued use of the drug in the face of an unacceptably hazardous adverse reaction. Now, if you look at the corresponding text in the PLR format, you'll see that that text was really removed. And the focus was on a much more absolute or categorical definition for a contraindication. So patients for whom no potential benefit makes the risk acceptable. You can see there was a shift there in terms of what the intent of the contraindication section was, so that the contraindication section was optimally conveying the information that it was best intended to convey. So with that in mind, in some cases, it may be appropriate to reclassify the risk. So if you have certain clinical situations that are listed in the contraindication section in the old format, but the drug can be used safely in practice in those situations with the appropriate risk mitigation strategies, you could consider moving that information to another section, more appropriate location, such as warnings and precautions. And this is a bit of an abstract concept, I realize that, so I'll try to illustrate it in a moment with an example. Some of the other things to keep in mind when reviewing the contraindication section, as appropriate, ensure that each contraindication includes a brief description of the situation, description of the type and nature of the adverse reactions, and a cross-reference to a more detailed discussion elsewhere in the PI. Now, having said that, if the description of the adverse reactions is very lengthy, or if there are numerous contraindications, it may very well be appropriate to just consider including the cross-reference in the contraindication section, and then having the additional information in another section, such as warnings and precautions. So again, I think best illustrated with an example. Here in the old format text under contraindications, it starts out saying that drug X is contraindicated in patients who've demonstrated a previous hypersensitivity to it. Then starting there in the green text, there's a statement that says, continued use of drug X is contraindicated in patients with severely depressed bone marrow function. Well, if you read down further with me through warnings under the first subsection heading there in blue, it says that drug X can severely depress bone marrow function. And it goes on from there. I've truncated the text in the interest of space. And then further down under precautions, in red there, it appears there's risk mitigation strategies proposed. So complete blood counts should be monitored prior to each dose. So I think what really emerges as you read through this is that severe bone marrow function depression is an expected adverse reaction for the use of this drug. And that raises the question of whether the continued use of the drug being contraindicated in patients with severely depressed bone marrow function is really optimally conveyed in the contraindication section or somewhere else, bearing in mind what we just talked about how the old format to the PLR format regulations change with respect to the contraindication section. So let's gray out the old format text, and again, I'll project what I proposed for the PLR converted text. And a couple of things to point out here. So first, under Section 4 contraindications, I retained the hypersensitivity reactions as a contraindication because it turns out it's not theoretical. In fact, anaphylaxis has been reported. So I included a brief description of that and a cross-reference where the healthcare provider can go for additional information. But the other notable thing is that that statement about continued use of the drug being contraindicated in patients with severely depressed bone marrow function is no longer in contraindications. The risk has been reclassified, and now it's all described under subsection 5.1 in warnings and precautions. So this section now starts out by describing the risk, and then the second paragraph there goes into risk mitigation strategies. So monitor complete blood counts prior to each dose of drug X. Withhold drug X treatment in patients who have an absolute neutrophil count below a certain level, and so forth. So there's really not necessarily, this is not an example to illustrate that there's new information here. This information could have all been in the old format labeling. It's about how to optimally distribute the information, bearing in mind that shift in the definition or the intent of the contraindication section from old to Section 5, warnings and precautions. 5.4 is now written so that the subsection title characterizes the risk. So there's no ambiguity what you're going to read about when you read the subsection title. And then after a brief description of the risk, rather than should be used with caution in these patients, I've actually provided known strategies to mitigate the risk of the adverse reaction. So institute a prophylactic bowel regimen to mitigate potential constipation and so forth. The last thing to point out is I've revised this final sentence to remove language that could infer a contraindication. So instead of drug X should not be used in patients with severe constipation, it says discontinue drug X if severe constipation occurs. Continuing our tour of key safety-related sections of the FPI, I'm going to talk about the adverse reaction section, section 6 in the PLR format. This is a section that I think is ripe with opportunities for improvement when PLR conversions are done. So I actually have a couple of examples, but I want to start out with some principles first. We've seen this before, but again, dosing regimens not described in the DNA section must not be implied or suggested in other sections of the labeling. Again, this is applicable to all sections of the PI, but I put it here because I tend to see unapproved dosing regimens sneak into this section more than some of the others. And I'll illustrate in an example in a moment one potential approach to address that kind of situation. When developing this section, review to ensure the adverse reactions are appropriately described. So some of the things to think about. Rates expressed in percentages should ordinarily be rounded to the nearest integer. That helps with readability. And it's important to remove redundancies and events not likely related to the drug. So for example, events for which the placebo rate equals or exceeds the rate of the drug. The PLR regulations require that adverse reactions that occurred in clinical studies be presented separately from those that occurred in spontaneous reporting, which makes sense because there's a difference in the quality of the data there. But one of the challenges with older products in particular is that sometimes the source of the adverse reactions cannot be readily determined. It's not really clear whether it occurred in a clinical study or in another setting. And in those situations, you could consider omitting numbered subsections when you're PLR converting and instead including a list of the adverse reactions preceded by a modified post-marketing caveat statement, which would provide the context for the healthcare provider when they read the listing. And I'll show an example of that in a moment. One additional point would be to include management strategies for clinically significant adverse reactions in the warnings and precautions section rather than in the adverse reaction section. I tend to think of the adverse reaction section as more of a data section. And you can imagine if you start listing a lot of management strategies in that listing, it has potential to lose its significance. It could get obscured by all of the adverse reactions, which sometimes can be quite lengthy. So let's illustrate. I have, again, my first example here. In the old format text, we have the adverse reaction section. And in this case, there's actually a common adverse reactions table with frequencies of several adverse reactions presented. And in the table, you'll notice that adverse reaction frequencies from the lowest dosage to the highest dosage, you'll see that there doesn't even really appear to be a clear dose-response trend with respect to adverse reactions as you go from lowest to highest. Calling your attention to the row with headache, because it turns out that the frequency of headache was actually greater in the placebo arm than in any of the drug arms. And then below the table, there's a statement about adverse reactions that occurred in spontaneous reporting. And one of those in that listing is asthenia. But again, if you look at the table, it appears asthenia was already described in the clinical studies and is listed in the most common adverse reactions table. So with all of these things in mind now, let me shrink and gray out the old format and bring up the PLR converted text. So a few things to point out. In addition to the fact that I've created subsection 6.1 clinical trials experience, I think the main thing to point out is that the table has been greatly simplified. So now I've included only the approved dosage arm in this table. Now, if there were a clear dose-response trend with respect to adverse reactions, and that was important to call to the attention of the healthcare provider, perhaps because there was real concern that the drug could be used at unapproved dosages, then really the place to optimally convey that information would be in a warning and precaution, because that section allows for discussion of risks with unapproved uses. If it was really important, you could also potentially include something about it in the commentary below this table in section 6, but what you really don't want to do is have all of these detailed adverse reaction rates for unapproved dosage arms where you could potentially be implying or suggesting safe use of unapproved dosages to the healthcare provider. Some of the other things to point it out, I rounded percentages to the nearest integer. I think it makes the table easier to read. And I removed headache from the table in this example. As I mentioned before, it occurred at a greater incidence in the placebo arm than any of the drug arms. So I've modified the criteria for what goes into the table, and that's shortened the table a little bit. The other thing to point out is under 6.2, post-marketing experience, I've listed the adverse reactions separately that occurred in the spontaneous reporting setting, but I removed asthenia. And this is a consideration, again, to reduce some of these redundancies in this section. Given that asthenia is already described in the adverse reactions table from clinical studies in 6.1, there really isn't any clear value in repeating it in 6.2, even if it was reported in spontaneous reporting. Now, if there was something different about the quality of asthenia or some additional information about it, potentially there it could be appropriate to include it. But this is just some of the things you can think about when you're trying to reduce some of the laundry lists that sometimes tend to sneak up with some of these older drug labeling. Example 2 is meant to illustrate an example of a product that's even older, where you, as you might notice here in the old format text, there are no rates. There are no common adverse reactions table. And this is not all that uncommon with drugs that are much older. But I still think there's opportunities for improvement. So let's walk through this example together. Under the adverse reactions section heading, it starts out by noting that infection has occurred with use of drug oxide. Then the next sentence in blue is all about what to do if infection occurs. So it's about management strategies. That's followed by another sentence about some other adverse reactions reported with the use of the drug. So the question that I have right away is, did these adverse reactions occur in clinical studies, or did they occur in another setting, such as spontaneous reports? And again, if you look at the text, it's not really clear. So let's see what I proposed here. I grayed out the old format text, and now the PLR converted text starts out in section 6, adverse reactions. Right under that section heading, alongside guidance recommendation, I've included the listing of the adverse reactions described elsewhere in the labeling. And where I've listed infection, rather than giving management strategies right there, I've included a cross-reference to warnings and precautions where the healthcare provider can go for management strategies. The other main thing to point out here is, as I noted earlier, because the source of the adverse reactions is not clear, and data availability may be an issue with a product this old, you could consider, in order to provide accurate and truthful statement to the healthcare provider to give them the context that they need, including this type of a caveat statement prior to the listing of the adverse reactions. So it starts out with the following adverse reactions associated with the use of drug oxide were identified in clinical studies or post-marketing reports. So again, that gives them the context of where that information might be coming from. The last safety-related section I want to talk about today is the overdosage section. This is section 10 in the PLR format. This is a section that I find sometimes gets neglected when PLR conversions are done, but I would propose that there's a lot of opportunity to improve this section. It's important to ensure that information is accurate and up to date. And again, that's true for the entire PI, but I think post-marketing experience with overdosage can really help inform the content of the section. As you all may know, when a drug's initially approved, in many cases there's very little or sometimes no human overdosage data. And then as experience with the drug grows over time, a lot of times you'll get additional information that can help really fill in this section. It's important to remove animal data when human data are available. This section must be based on human data. In a specific example, I'd like to show one of the differences, again, between the old format and the PLR format regulations with respect to the LD50, which is sometimes also called the median lethal dose. If you look at the old format regulation there on the left for the overdosage section, old format regulations actually required that if it was available, this section include the oral LD50 of the drug in animals. Well, now, if you look at the PLR format regulations, that statement was removed entirely. And I think that's probably because of a couple of things. One is, again, because this section must be based on human data, and animal data are included only if human data are unavailable. And also because there's questions about the interpretability of the LD50 for a healthcare provider, its clinical interpretability and its utility. Some other principles when you're revisiting this section in a PLR conversion. Review the general recommendations and the specific recommendations for overdosage management and remove unqualified recommendations for which data are lacking for the specific drug or drug class. Now, sometimes general recommendations can be very appropriate if they're helpful to the healthcare provider and qualified for that drug or drug class. But sometimes we do see statements that are very vague and turn out to really not be well qualified or qualified at all. It's important to avoid describing dosages exceeding the maximum recommended dosage for which signs and symptoms of overdosage were not reported. This gets back to that issue of not implying or suggesting unapproved dosing regimens in other sections of the labeling if they're not in the DNA section. And then rather than enumerating the patients with overdosage from spontaneous reports, you could consider just focusing on the signs and symptoms of overdosage and other clinically relevant information. And that's really just a strategy to consider to keep the labeling from getting outdated as quickly. And I'll illustrate what I mean with an example. So my first example for this section, old format text under the overdosage section heading, there's an admission that experience with drug X overdose in humans is limited, which is not uncommon when drugs are initially approved. And then following that are symptoms and signs that have been observed in isolated cases. The next paragraph is all about the oral LD50, there in blue, of the drug in mice and rats. And then the next statement, starting there in red, is a rather vague statement that says measures that may detoxify the gut include administration of charcoal and a cathartic. Following that is a statement about contacting the Poison Control Center for current overdosage management information. So graying out the old format text, let's talk about what I proposed here. So in the PLR converted text, you'll notice that section 10 is much shorter. And what I did here is I focused on updating the information on overdosage range and signs and symptoms. So this could have been based on post-marketing information. It's helpful where you have that information to give a range in which these signs and symptoms occurred, so the healthcare provider can help put those two things together. I've also included some additional signs and symptoms like drowsiness, memory loss. This example is as much about what I took out as what I've added in, though. So what I took out was I took out the oral LD50 statement because, again, you remove animal data when human data are available. I also, in this case, just for illustration purposes, removed the statement about measures that may detoxify the gut because in this case, it turns out to be unqualified recommendation for this specific drug or drug class. Again, that's not always going to be the case, and if it's appropriate to retain, then certainly it's fine to do so. And in general, when the old format text has included a statement about contacting the Poison Control Center, once it's been PLR converted, that has been retained. My last example from overdosage is to illustrate a couple other points. So in this example, under old format text, under overdosage section there, you'll see that the first sentence starts out by, so it says drug X overdosage has been reported in 4 subjects. The next sentence says that 2 subjects who received the drug at a dosage of 60 milligrams over multiple days did not experience any or did not report any adverse outcome. So they appear to do just fine. But if you look down to the dosage and administration section, you'll see the recommended dosage of this drug is just 20 milligrams once daily. So it appears that in these 2 subjects at 3 times the recommended dosage, nothing bad seemed to happen. But it makes me wonder about why that statement's in there and how helpful that is. Then if we read on, there in blue, it says that there have been 2 spontaneous reports of subjects who, after a single oral dose of 80 milligrams, did indeed experience signs and symptoms like abdominal pain, nausea, and so forth. So applying some of the principles we talked about, let's look and see what I proposed for the PLR converted text. So again, first of all, section 10 is shorter, and I really focused on the signs and symptoms of overdosage rather than listing the number of spontaneous reports of overdosage. So I've emphasized the 80 milligram dosage. I've indicated that it's 4 times the approved recommended dosage, and I've listed the signs and symptoms that were seen at that single oral dose. What I didn't do was say that 2 subjects have reported this in spontaneous reports, because you can imagine that a week from now, if a 3rd report comes in, another subject experiences the same signs and symptoms at the same dosage, one could argue that this labeling is now outdated. So this is just a strategy to consider to keep the information in the labeling truthful and accurate without it potentially becoming outdated as quickly. The other main point here is I took out this statement about the subjects who at 60 milligrams appeared not to have anything bad happen. Because again, the problem with this is it could imply safe use of these unapproved dosages. So I don't think we would want healthcare providers to think, maybe I'll try 3 times the recommended dosage in my patient and see what happens. It raises a question also whether these data were really, of what quality were they? Were these 2 subjects in spontaneous reports? How convinced would we be that we wouldn't see overdosage if another subject received 60 milligrams? And also this kind of statement is not really within the spirit of the PLR regulations for overdosage. So the overdosage regulations require what is the dose that leads to signs and symptoms of overdosage and how do you manage those? There's no requirement to include information about the absence of overdosage or the absence of signs and symptoms of overdosage. Okay, so briefly talking about the clinical study section. I don't have examples for this section because it's difficult to illustrate befores and afters without having a lot of text. And also in the interest of time, we also heard about this section in an earlier talk, but I do want to just go through a couple of principles that I think may be useful for older drugs in particular. So one would be to move clinical study information that appears in other sections of the old format to the clinical study sections. We kind of looked at this with the indications and usage example, where we had all of that additional kind of data supporting approval information, where again, that information would be more optimally conveyed in clinical studies. And again, we've seen this before, but ensure that unapproved indications or uses and unapproved dosing regimens are not implied or suggested, and Eric talked about this in his talk with some examples. And then for older drugs that do not contain a clinical study section in the old format PI, and that, if you remember, the old format regulations do not require a clinical study section, so it's not all that uncommon to find old format PI that don't have a clinical study section. In that situation, in general, you should not create a clinical study section if the efficacy data that supported approval are not readily available, or they don't provide useful information about safe and effective use of the drug. And last but certainly not least is the patient counseling information section. This is section 17. It's the last one in the PLR format, but it's an important one, and it's new to the PLR format. And really the main point about this is that it's required. So unless it's clearly inapplicable, create and develop this section, even if the corresponding subsection does not exist in the old format PI. And the corresponding subsection was called information for patients. It's found in the precautions section, and sometimes it's present in the old format, sometimes it's not. If the old format PI does include the information for patient subsection, it's important to review its content and to determine what information to retain, add, or remove. And the patient counseling information section of labeling guidance was finalized a couple of years ago and provides a lot of recommendations on what type of information is appropriate for this section and what is not appropriate for this section. So bringing it all together, very briefly, developing other parts of the PI. Once your FPI has been developed, that's really the optimal time to develop highlights. And we heard this in an earlier talk as well. Remember that highlights is intended to be a concise summary of the most critical information that a healthcare provider needs to use a drug safely and effectively. It's not intended to be everything, but the information is extracted from the FPI. So the sensible time to develop highlights is once your FPI has been developed. Ensure that you have accurate cross-references to the appropriate sections or subsections throughout the labeling, and develop the table of contents. So in summary, voluntary PLR conversions are encouraged and important. I recognize that they can be challenging, but I think they're of great value to pursue. Consider prioritizing labeling of drugs with highest use or complex safety issues for voluntary PLR conversion. They may benefit the most from PLR conversion. And really, I hope I've illustrated that PLR conversion involves much more than moving information from one location in the old format to the corresponding PLR location. Rather, it's an opportunity to review all parts of the labeling to ensure that the labeling is truthful and accurate. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. I'm going to turn it over now to our industry panelist, Ingrid Brzezinski.
Thank you, Farooq. I think it was really an excellent overview, and I really like the examples. The before and after, I think, were really, really good. I think PLR has been a big improvement. I think it's much easier to find things in the label. The format, the highlights. We also work on core data sheets and European labels, and when you can just lay them all out and they all have the same order, it's a lot easier. When the rule first came out, we looked at all our products, and we said, okay, all the new ones will have to be, we'll come to them each. Then we looked at the ones that were due in the 7 years, and we sort of sorted them out and said, well, some years are going to be heavy, we'll start early, some are going to be better. And then there were the voluntary ones that now we're actually doing as part of the PLLR. So in the long run, they'll all be done. I have 2 little case studies that I'd like to talk about that were actually products that were marketed that we either added new indications or new information into, and we had to convert into the PLR format. And 2 of the ladies in the audience worked on this product, so they'll probably know it. The guidance was effective in June of '06. We had a product that was marketed with several indications now, and we were putting a new indication together for submission in August. So we found out end of January. PLR had been coming, but we thought, let's make it, let's try to see if we can submit this. Nope, 2 months. So we decided our clinical team for this new indication, we really wanted them to focus 5 months left on their new indication. Just get the clinicians, the safety people, everybody just focus on your part. The global labeling person for that really just focused on that. Said, don't worry, another team will take care of it. So another team, mostly regulatory, went through the guidance and actually converted the old label into the new format. And the person working on the new indication had taken the template of the new format, so we were able to mesh it together. We thought it would be really easy. Well, especially when we got to the highlights section, we found that, when we got to the highlights section, the new indication team wanted everything to be just about their product. And we said, no, we need to look at the overall risk of the product. Not everybody is going to be on that. That will be highlighted in warnings, precautions, ADRs. We'll have a separate ADR section for your new indication. And they just couldn't believe it. They said, no, it's our big thing. So we were able to get through that. The head person in clinical and the head person in safety were able to work through that. And what was really interesting was especially the warnings and precautions, that it was now bullets. And we found it so helpful, the clinicians in the group, that it wasn't just use caution. Well, what does that mean? You know, it was check your blood count for XYZ, check for this test. Before putting a patient on, do that. They knew what to do. Everybody's always like, well, what do you want me to do? So it was really helpful. And the physicians working on it, it was our first one, really thought it was great. They really liked it. So looking at the overall risk, I think, led up into the whole risk management piece that we have now. The other example I have is another drug that was approved in the 90s, and we had two issues with that one, and that was the warnings precautions section. So we had warnings, and we had some things on hepatic and renal. We also had some information in the precautions section. Well, how are we going to combine it? So we had a very creative person in the group who created a table with 3 columns: the old wording, the proposed new wording, and comments. And it was around the December holidays, so he made warnings in green and precautions in red. And then when it merged, it was great. You know, you could really see, oh, that's duplicate, we don't need that. So it's a very easy tool. You can use any colors you want, but it really helped. Then the AEs versus ADRs. That was something, a lot of discussion on that, because an ADR, an adverse drug reaction, is causality it implies, and it's a reason to believe. There was a physician who'd worked in the late 90s on getting this product approved and said, there's no way I am saying that there's causality of this when it was just voluntary reported or as an adverse event. No, I just can't say that. And, you know, someone had said, well, why don't you just cross off the word events and put ADRs? And he just shuddered. The physician just said, I just can't do that. So FDA was great. We worked with them. We said, well, what if we convert the whole table to ADRs? And they said, well, that's, you know, really a whole new submission. That'll be under review. It'll take some time. We were able to actually compromise, and the table currently said, now granted it was an older product, ADRs reported by X number of patients percentage. So anyone who, you know, looks at the ADRs is fine, but the fact that reported by patients was a really nice compromise because it implied that it wasn't actually the causality. So that was a really 2 examples that we've had where we were able to, as Eric said this morning, work with the agency and also work with our teams. You know, we try to be as flexible as possible, but still with our teams, but still make sure that we follow the rules.
All right, I think we're going to open it up. Thank you so much, Ingrid. I think we'll open it up for
Yes, so first off, I wanted to very much thank Farouk and Ingrid for a very comprehensive presentation about PLR conversions. I think you've inspired us all, and I'm anticipating and very hopeful that FDA will be receiving large volumes of voluntary PLR conversions in the next several months, right? So just a plug for voluntary PLR conversions. But with that, yes, I'd like to open up to the first speaker. Go ahead. Microphone 1.
Hi, Roya Bebahani from Pfizer.
That's all right. Thanks.
Okay, just a question about the clinical study section. For older products, sometimes the clinical study section is based on published literature. So what is the FDA's position on when you're converting to PLR? Would you still rather, you know, document that as a published literature in the clinical study section?
Just to clarify, when you say based on published literature, would the old format actually include a discussion of the studies, or would it just list references?
No, had the description of the study, but it was based on the published literature.
I see. It's a good question. I mean, I've seen that before, and I've seen that with approvals of older drugs. Sometimes when an older drug has been on the market but not previously approved under an NDA, and a clinical study section is created, sometimes a summary of the literature is given, and it's usually very brief, so that there's some discussion in the clinical study section. I think it really depends on the situation. I would say that if it's just a listing of references, that's really not going to provide useful information to the healthcare provider. So in those cases, you could consider omitting the clinical study section. But if there is information that's helpful to the healthcare provider, even if it's based on published literature, that could very well be considered for inclusion in the PLR converted.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, let's go to our first online question, if we could, please. And those of you in the room, feel free to step up to the microphones. Online.
With regard to contraindications for hypersensitivity reactions, if there are no known reports of hypersensitivity reactions, is it appropriate to remove the text pertaining to the hypersensitivity contraindication?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is something that the PLR regulations emphasize, as does the contraindications and warnings and precautions sections labeling, is to really go back, because I think a lot of times that statement is kind of put in as a catch-all. If in some cases it may be appropriate to retain if hypersensitivity has been seen with other drugs in the class, and there's a likelihood that there would be some cross-reactivity. So it's not just that if there has never been a report with that specific drug, it's always appropriate to remove it. But I think if there isn't a real mechanistic basis, if other drugs in the class haven't necessarily had that issue, and there have been no reports, and there's been years and years of experience with the drug, then it may be appropriate to remove that, because it really could get into the territory of being theoretical.
Yeah, we actually had some experience with that. On our first drug, we kept hypersensitivity in because we had one case, and FDA said, no, you can cover that elsewhere. I think you need to remove it. So our second drug, there were people in the company who still felt, well, it's always been in there. They put it in, and the division, very nice, told us, we've told you no once, we've told you no twice. We really don't want to see hypersensitivity again. So we relayed that to the lawyers, and it's no longer submitted.
I think one of the challenges with that is if it appears in every labeling, then when it really matters, it loses, again, it kind of loses its significance. People sort of tune it out. So making sure you really think about that, I think, helps with making sure that when it's really important, it's not going to get obscured or lost.
All right, microphone number 1, please.
If there's very detailed non-clinical information in an older label, are there cases where you would recommend keeping that in, possibly putting it in section 13.2? And if so, would you recommend putting in a corresponding human equivalent dose?
That's a great question. I'm not really an expert with the non-clinical studies. We have very minimal regulations on that section 13 for non-clinical studies, and there's no guidance. I would say that 13.2 is really intended just to convey any non-clinical study information that's essential. I think the regulations say essential for the safe and effective use of the drug, not conveyed elsewhere. So it's really a judgment of how important is the information. Does it tie into some kind of risk information that would be actionable or inform prescribing decisions? And if that's the case, then it may be appropriate to retain it. But I think in some cases, if it's just additional information and it's really not tied to a risk or doesn't inform prescribing decisions, it could be considered potentially for removal when you PLR convert.
Okay. Microphone number 2, please.
So in the adverse reaction section, one of your examples had the bulleted list of certain events that happens. I think it's before the 6.1 section. So you just have the bullet of the event, and then you have a cross-reference to the section and warnings that discusses that. So how do you decide which events from warnings goes into that AR section? Is it every single warning, or how do you decide?
That's a great question. So basically, that listing is supposed to describe the adverse reactions that have occurred with the drug or other drugs in the class as appropriate. And the emphasis there is on adverse reaction. So if it's an adverse reaction that's actually occurred with the drug or drugs in the class, then it would be included in that listing because it's important information and it directs the healthcare provider where they can find additional information. What you typically don't want to include, though, are risks that haven't actually been demonstrated in humans. So if it's animal data, maybe it's embryo-fetal toxicity and it was from an animal study, you wouldn't necessarily put that in that listing because it's technically not an adverse reaction. It's a risk that would be appropriately conveyed in warnings and precautions and other sections of the labeling. But other than that, I think if it's an adverse reaction that's occurred with the drug or other drugs in the class and it's described elsewhere in the labeling, this is an opportunity to call the attention to it so that you make sure that you have appropriate cross-referencing throughout.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, let's go to our next online question, please.
What would you do if you have more adverse reactions in the vehicle control group compared to the treatment group?
Can you repeat the question one more time? I'm sorry.
In the adverse reaction section for presentation of your adverse reactions, what would you do if you have a greater incidence of adverse reactions in the vehicle control group compared to the incident rate in the treatment group?
Right. So I think I showed an example of that. I guess vehicle in this case would be the placebo. If in those situations, unless there is a compelling factor that merits discussion of the adverse reaction, for example, timing, where there's a compelling reason to believe it was related to the vehicle, you would remove those kinds of adverse reactions because they really are not adverse reactions, right? They're adverse events. If it occurred more commonly in the vehicle than in the drug arm, then it's really of little value to the healthcare provider. In those rare exceptions where there is a reason to retain it, then I think it's important to additionally describe that in the commentary.
Yeah, no.
Okay, microphone number 1, please.
Right. My name is Abby Adibwadi from the FDA. So thank you for your excellent presentation. I just wanted some clarification. I think it was slide 46 where you talk about the patient counseling information section. Could you just give an example of when it could be clearly inapplicable since it's a required section? If you could just give an example.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we.
Can you repeat the question? It may have been a little quiet for the people online.
Certainly. The question is there an example of a time we can omit the patient counseling information section from labeling?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. One of the things to bear in mind is that sometimes people think that if it's a drug that's used inpatient or in a controlled setting like a doctor's office, then you don't really need a patient counseling information section. It's important to understand that's not the intent of the section. The intent of the section is to facilitate provider-patient discussion, and that can be just as important if it's an outpatient drug that a patient self-administers or a drug that's given in a healthcare setting. I think it's extremely rare circumstances where you could consider omitting the section. If I remember right, the patient counseling information guidance actually provides one example, and I think they say that if it's certain standard intravenous fluids, you could consider potentially in those cases there may not really be anything to convey to the patient. Having said that, if the standard intravenous fluid contains other components like potassium, there may still be risk information or other information that it would be important to provide. So I would say if you're not sure, when in doubt, develop one, and then during the course of the review, perhaps there can be some discussions about whether it really is merited or not.
Thank you.
Sure.
Another online question, please.
Can FDA comment whether there are situations where management strategies related to dosage adjustments need to be in both a warning and precaution and also described in the dosage and administration section?
I actually have an example of that for our next one. We had a product that had some ADRs, but it depended on how the patient was ramped up. And basically, some of the physicians who were working with it, the investigators said, we're not really sure about how to dose this. And we were able to come up with, which I'll go into in the next panel, but we basically have information in dosing, warnings, precautions, ADRs, ClinPharm, and clinical studies. So it can be described in many different ways as far as the mechanism of action. It's a warning what you should not do. It's an ADR that can happen, and clinically why it's happened.
I would just add that, just bear in mind what's the primary intent of that section. So if it's, let's say it's a risk of, let's say a drug's indicated only for subcutaneous injection and there have been reports of adverse reactions when the drug's been given intravenously, the DNA section would emphasize what not to do. So avoid intravenous administration, and then you could include a cross-reference to warnings and precautions where the reader would go for this discussion of the detailed discussion of the safety risk. So it's really about, again, thinking about what does this primary intent of the section, and that helps, again, reduce some of the redundancy. But sometimes, as you noted, it's very appropriate to have it described in more than one location.
Microphone number 2, please, go ahead.
Hey, Dominic Pecot from Boehringer Ingelheim. So I have a question. On the adverse reaction section, you mentioned about avoiding redundancy between 6.1 clinical trials experience and if you see it in post-marketing. So thinking about like a fixed dose combination and you delineate by component. If you have an identified ADR by each component, what are your thoughts on if you see the same ADR for each component? Would you necessarily present it for each component, or would you describe it as the whole for the product? I'm just curious of what your thoughts are.
Really good question.
So we have some combination products, and if the product is given alone, it's a larger dose than if being given in combination with one. So there's certain ADRs that you'll find with the product, say product A. If it's given with product B, it has more efficacy, it has actually better safety because that drug that has a lot of drug interactions, it's a smaller dose. So our PK people are actually able to do some modeling and say, this drug would act so and so much at X milligram versus Y milligram. And then we have a third drug now that contains that component as well. And that's an even smaller dose. So originally we thought we would just take everything that was in drug A and put it in drug B. And then we said, well, no, we couldn't say what was just due to drug B because we never tested that alone. But we could say we have seen this in drug A and drug A and B together. We have not seen this. Or we didn't say we have not seen this, but we excluded that because we hadn't seen it because it was a smaller dose. That's just our experience we've had.
Okay, and in terms of, sorry.
No, I'd like to also add to that. I think what's important for fixed dose combination product in section 6 is the prescriber needs to understand what those adverse reactions are associated with that fixed dose combination.
Right.
So they're together. If I give these two products, this is what I will expect to happen.
Okay.
The only reason to separate in 6, if indeed the product is also approved for single use. However, section 5 might be an opportunity to discuss, let's say that fixed dose combination product A has a higher risk of hepatotoxicity. In section 5, you may discuss that so the prescriber may know, oh, I understand what's coming, why this is happening. Does that make sense? But 6 is where you want to say, this is the combination, this is what I expect to happen with the combination.
And just to clarify real quick, would you say that also applies to 6.2 when you're talking about post-marketing and you're relating that real-world evidence now to the prescriber? So sometimes you have a fixed dose combination where 6.2 post-marketing is split by component, but then you have some labels where they're not split, right? So that's what I was more getting at with my question is in that post-marketing setting. Would you want to show this? Would you want to separate out if you're seeing the same ADR for one component and another, or would you just put it together and it's seen as a whole in the post-marketing setting?
I mean, I think, like Anne-Marie said, you wouldn't want to imply if it's the fixed, you're right, if it's the combination product that's the focus, you'd want to emphasize that. And I'm trying to think of a scenario where it would be important to list the ADR separately for each component if they're identical.
Right.
And if they're seen in the combination, I'm not sure you can think of it. I don't know if you have a specific scenario in mind.
No, it's just a question.
It's a good question.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
All right, let's take an online question, please.
If you omit the clinical studies section, do you use the word none after section 14, or do you delete the entire section from the label?
Good question. So in general, you would just delete the section, and we do that with other sections. Sometimes, for example, if you have a drug with no drug abuse and dependence information, you wouldn't put section 9, none, you would just omit it. The only section where you're required to say none, even if there are no contraindications, is section 4 contraindications. That's a regulatory requirement. But generally, you would just omit the section.
Okay, for the folks in the room, we've still got about 5 minutes left if you want to line up with the microphones. But right now, let's go with another online question, please.
Can you discuss some of the challenges with developing highlights during PLR conversion of labeling for older drugs?
How much time do we have? There are a lot of challenges, and I can speak to a few of them. I think I didn't go into that in my talk just because of the interest of time. I think some of the challenges are the same for older drugs as they are for new PLR. We heard in earlier talks today, it's about keeping it to less than half a page or less. And the question always becomes, what's the most critical information? A lot of that just comes down to judgment and back and forth discussions. But maybe some things to think about for older drugs specifically. I would say sometimes the adverse reactions heading in highlights can pose challenges when you have a really older drug that has no frequencies in the adverse reaction section of the FPI. And the regulations actually require that the adverse reactions heading in highlight specify the inclusion criteria. So what was the cutoff for the adverse reactions you're listing? Well, if you don't have that information in the FPI, you could argue that that information in that situation would be inapplicable, and you could consider just listing the common adverse reactions and not putting in an arbitrary cutoff. The other thing potentially would be recent major changes. We heard about that earlier today. I think that can sometimes be challenging, deciding whether or not you should have a recent major changes heading when you PLR convert. In general, the implementation guidance says no. A PLR conversion alone doesn't warrant creation of an RMC heading. But in some cases, as we saw today, for example, if you're adding important new risk mitigation strategies to a warning, an existing warning and precaution for the old format, it might be helpful to call that to the healthcare provider section attention when you approve the PLR conversion. And then sometimes with the initial US approval year, and that's not really something you take out of the FPI, but you would be surprised with some of these drugs that were approved in the 1930s. You have to do a lot of digging to figure out the accurate initial year of US approval, which is not really a challenge you have with new drugs when it's more straightforward typically. So
I would also like to add to Brooke, I think those are some great points. I always find the box warning and highlights at 20 lines. We have some old labels with some very long box warnings that are maybe a page or two long.
Yes.
And to get that information, first off, we obviously chop it down in the FPI, but then even to get it to 20 lines in highlights can sometimes be challenging, I would think.
Okay, microphone number 2, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, when you were talking about the overdosage section, there was a line at the end that you referred to the National Poison Control Center. I hadn't seen that in a lot of labels. So is that recommended or required, or?
That's a great question. So, we don't have a guidance on the overdosage section. I hope we do one day. I think it would be helpful. The PLR regulations actually do say something about per poison control center as one of the general potential management strategies for overdosage if it's appropriate, which is actually new to the PLR regulations. The old format regulations don't mention the poison control center. So I think based on that, the regulations support including something about that if it's appropriate for that drug. Having said that, I wouldn't put it in as a blanket statement, because if you really have good treatment recommendations already in place that are well qualified, then referring a healthcare practitioner to the poison control center is not necessarily going to add a lot of information. I think in cases where it has been in the old format labeling, in general, it's been retained unless there's a lot of new information about treatment recommendations, specific treatment recommendations.
Okay, we've got time to sneak in one last online question, please.
When PLR converting older labeling, how should we approach events that we believe are not possibly related to the drug in the adverse reaction section?
We heard this a little bit earlier, but I would definitely encourage removing them. I know sometimes it can be challenging, especially with older drugs where you don't have the source data. But sometimes, I showed some strategies to consider in my talk, but sometimes we'll see events listed, I've seen things like normal tooth eruption, I've seen insect bite. Unless there's a really compelling reason to think that the drug, and again, the regulatory standard is just some basis to believe a causal relationship. It doesn't have to be established, but with those kinds of events, even without having to go back and do data review, unless you can make a compelling argument for keeping it in the labeling, I would say that should be removed. Remember, the section is intended to give the healthcare provider what they need to worry about, what they need to know. And a lot of healthcare providers don't know the difference between a regulatory definition of an adverse event versus an adverse reaction. And if the section's called adverse reactions, then I think it's incumbent upon those who have the privilege of reviewing the data and having the source data to really parse through that and give the healthcare provider the information they need so that they don't have to figure out on their own, well, is this something that I might see with this drug, or is it something that was just seen in the course of the clinical trials?